Welcome back to the Harper Tech Academy. This is the first mix looking at legislation. So this mix is all about looking at the difference between an act, a regulation, and a code of practice. So let's get going. It's important that you actually watch this mix first before you watch the food legislation. So what we're going to look at is the understanding of how legislation works throughout, from federal through to state through to the councils. We're going to look at the differences between an act, a regulation, and a code of practice. And finally, I'm going to give you examples of each. So I hope you enjoy this first mix on legislation. So before we actually delve further into legislation, let's define legislation. So legislation is the law, and to ensure the stability, safety for the hospitality industry, laws are in place to protect the customers, employers, and employees. So let's actually have a look at how it works. So you'll notice here that you have the federal legislation, and from the federal legislation, then each state and territory of Australia actually have laws that are tied to the federal. And then at the local council area, the state laws are tied, so environmental health officers are actually employed by the local councils. So now that you know that legislation is at the federal, state, and also local, let's actually look at the three different types of legislation. We have an act, we have a regulation, and a code of practice. So the first one is an act. So an act is a legislation set down by Parliament. Acts give general regulation making powers and allow specific regulations to be made under them. Some examples of that are the Food Act 2003 for food safety, and also the Work Health and Safety Act 2011 New South Wales for work health and safety. So now we know that an act is from Parliament. Now, how a regulation differs, it's actually the rule or an order prescribed by an authority, and an example of that is the New South Wales Food Authority, and it's especially designed to actually regulate conduct. So a regulation are the rules that are based on the act which has actually been passed. Examples of it is the Food Regulation 2010 and the Work Health Safety Regulation 2011, New South Wales. So from the Act comes the regulation with the rules. From the regulations come codes of practices, which are guides to guide different hospitality establishments in how they actually comply with the regulations and the Act. So they govern things like structural safety of buildings, health requirements for plumbing, ventilation, and specifications for fire escapes or exits. An example of that is New South Wales Work Cover, which we'll be talking about later. So this was the introduction to legislation. So we've looked at what an act is, how the regulations tie under that, and then the codes of practice, which actually tell us how to comply with the act and the regulations. This was a starter. Make sure that you watch the food safety legislation mix, and later on you'll actually see the work health and safety mix. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time at the Harper Tech Academy.